Welcome, dear students. The current session focuses on the problem of refining English language during the 18th century. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you will be able to understand what were the concerns and issues related to the problem of refining and purifying English language. Well, my dear students, uncertainty was not the only fault of the 18th century. This was not the only problem that they were uncertain about what to do. They were doubting, they were challenging, all the learning that had happened during the Renaissance time, all the inclusions in the language that had taken place during the Renaissance time. There was another fault, and that was the lack of a standard. So, at one hand, they did not they did not trust what was going on. At the other hand, they did not have a model to follow. What was the result? The result of all this was that they believed that there was a lot of corruption in the language. And they also thought or felt that all the language had gone, unchecked and, it has not followed any standard. Well, my dear students, if we look at the overall attitude of the 18th century, we would realize that one of the main concerns behind the efforts made to refine the language was that people had an attitude of frequent lament towards the past. They would look back at the past and they would, criticize, and they would say that language has constantly gone down. It was more like a regretful backward glance at the good old days. And they would look at the ancients as a model. So, it was Dryden's opinion that from Chaucer's time, the purity of English tongue began. However, unlike many other people, he was not convinced about the downward course of language. As far as Swift is concerned, for him the golden age was that of Elizabethans. His view about language was, he said, that corruptions in our language are happening very frequently, and he believed that there were very few writers who would use language correctly or who would escape all those faults of language. Well, my dear students, Dr. Johnson also agreed with this opinion, and actually the famous dictionary that Dr. Johnson compiled, he has given in this dictionary, he says, "I have studiously endeavored to collect examples and authorities from the writers before the Restoration, whose works I regard as the wells of English, undefiled as the pure sources of genuine diction." So, taking the ancients, taking the past as a model. This talk was just a sentimental regard for the past. All the time we say, all the parents say, well, our children are not like us. Well, our children are not like our parents. Well, the future generation is not like the past generation. So, this was the same kind of, I would say perennial belief that, people have. Coming back to Swift, I would say he was a conservative. And actually, his conservatism was grounded in a set of political beliefs, not only political beliefs, but also religious beliefs. And actually, these conservative political beliefs had an impact on his views about language as well. When it comes to religion, he cherished the authority of the church. So, of course, then he wanted an authority to look after language, an authority that would have all the political and religious, strength to give order, to give shape, to give form to language. He criticized the skeptical spirit of inquiry proposed by the Royal Society. He upheld classics but understood the merits of plain English as well. He admired the classical languages for their model, for their structure, for their order. But it does not mean that he was against, plain, simple English. Rather, he supported that because he thought that would make life of people easier. However, he was in favor of the use of English language only in one case, and that is when it would be free from all pollution. It would not be polluted with crude and careless usage. George Campbell, in his Philosophy of Rhetoric in 1776, says, I shall just mention another set of barbarisms, which also comes under this class and arises from the abbreviation. This is what the first thing he criticized, Campbell. He criticized and he called it barbarism, abbreviation of polysyllables, he said, by lopping off all the syllables except the first one, or the first and the second. And he gives the examples of that, and he says, instances of this type are hypochondriac, that people would only call hype, or reputation, that people would only call rep, or ultimate, only alt. So he has given many examples of, such abbreviations. And he says, happily all these affected terms have been denied the public suffrage. So, it was not only Swift, there were many other people who criticized the unchecked use of language during the times. My dear students, Swift also he also opposed the tendency to contract verbs. So, like Campbell, Swift also pointed out certain things, drudged this way of writing it, rebucked this way of writing it, disturbed, without, using E, just by, contracting the verbs, and fledged. So he gave many examples of these kind of things, and he was, of course, against this common usage. Swift also criticized young preachers and priests, and he says, young preachers fresh from the universities use all the modern terms of art, sham, banter, mob, bubble, bully, cutting, shuffling, and palming, all which and many more of the like stamp, as I have heard them often in the pulpit, so I have read them in some of those sermons that have made most noise of late. So, the kind of everyday usage language that they would talk in, he calls it just a noise. Well, my dear students, Swift expressed these views, this opinion that he had, in a letter to Tatler in 1710. And he called the attention again 2 years later in his proposal for correcting, improving, and ascertaining the English tongue. So, constantly he was making endeavors, he was making efforts, he was working on the improvement of English language, the way he thought it could be perfected. He published a letter as well, by the way. And dear students, he, in his work, published this letter that he says was written somebody, some, renowned person, and he has used this as a sample of how far the language was, corrupted during the times. He points out that this person, an accomplished person, wrote this letter and said, "Sir, I couldn't." Now, these are the things that he was against, Swift, these contractions. "Sir, I couldn't get the things you sent for all about town. I thought to have, again contractions, have come down myself, but then I'd have brought, I would have brought them." This is what Swift would have written, but this accomplished person has used a bit too much of contractions, which Swift has used as kind of a sample to plead his case against, all such cases. If you notice the text, you would find actually these kind of abbreviations used throughout the text that Swift was completely against. The letter continues, and we find the use of all such, instances. There are a bit too many of them. Actually, if you look at the text for yourself, you would find that the letter is almost half of it is written in contracted, abbreviated forms. By showing such samples and by giving suggestions and by pointing out the flaws of contracted verbs and the unchecked abbreviations, actually the intention of Swift was to help give some order and shape and form to English language. Swift gives the remedy that, these kind of work pieces, as they come, forward, they should be, taken care by responsible people. So, for instance, for the editor of this particular, work, he says that the editor should have checked this letter and should not have published it this way.